I think this is was a lava flow, but it doesn't look like a traditional lava flow. And it's because it's a lot of it what I call greenstone. It if you look at it, you'll see little tiny veins of green minerals that it's been under so much pressure that the water gets forced into the mineral matrix of the rock and it changes it. It makes it from black, it makes it that sort of greenish, and if you look at it, you'll see little veins of green minerals within it. So it shows you that this was at one time, very volcanically active, had a flow, but also that it's been under tremendous pressure. And that's going to be the story of almost all rocks in Rhode Island. They've been under tremendous pressure. This is relatively old. It's part of what's called the Blackstone group. It's somewhere in between 600 million and a billion years old. It's hard to date these rocks. We don't have exact dates on them because it's been under so much pressure, and you do things like force water into the mineral matrix, you screw up the chemistry of the crystal and you can't date it as well because you kind of mess up the clock. So we don't have an exact time on this. It's somewhere between 600 and 100 and a billion. 600 million and a billion. Okay. So we're going to go back down the hill, which is, by the way, way easier. We go back down the hill. We're going to go across the bridge because I want to show you an outcropping that's right there. Okay. And schist. So what you had is, this was a marine environment, and you had times when you had a lot of energy, the water was moving fast, and you had the sand and none of the fine stuff. And then you had times where the water was very quiet and you deposit the fine mud. Could be that a river changed course and you see it go from the main channel to the side channel, or more often it's that the water got deeper relative to the land. So the deep water where it's quieter, and the shallow where it's more like a beach. So a lot of things can do that. This is an area that at the time was subject to very violent uplift, violent pressure. So what happens is, if you think about sandstone, the little sand grains, they are first disconnected, and then over time you put them under a little bit of pressure and the grains themselves stick together. So picture this as being grains of sand. You press it a little bit and all of a sudden now you got a rock because you cemented the grains together. But you put them under tremendous pressure, you start warping the grains themselves and grinding them into each other. And it takes not just pressure but heat, because it starts getting weaker because it's hotter. So you start smushing them together and the individual grains of sand get distorted and almost remelted. So that's what you're seeing here, is that tremendous pressure, that you've lost all the structure of where it used to be sandstone. And this was created at a very unique time when, through most of the Earth's history, life was just very simple algae, maybe one-celled animals, maybe a few little simple worms. At the time, either right when this rock was laid down or not too long after, you had the most dramatic explosion of evolution in the history of the Earth. And nearly all the major forms of life evolved in that time. Probably because the levels of oxygen had increased, although there's still some mosquito there. Anyway, so if you hadn't have put this under so much pressure, you might have some really incredible fossils here. But unfortunately, you ruined it. Why did you put it under so much pressure? Because there was an island off the coast of Africa known as Avalonia, which goes all the way from Newfoundland to Georgia. And this island arc, like Japan or the Philippines, as this ancient ocean was closing, this island arc kept coming further and further towards closer to North America, or ancestral North America, eventually collided. So the pressure of a microcontinent hitting a continent creates enough pressure to create metamorphism. But then after that, after the continent, the Avalonia smashes into North America, you have Africa smashes into North America, and it makes the Appalachian Mountains. And so we were probably overlain by tens of thousands of feet of rock here. We probably had a mountain range that was similar to the Himalayas. Why aren't the Appalachian Mountains as big as the Himalayas now? Because they're old. Because you've had 400 million years, depending on which part of it, 400 million years for it to wear down. But they're still there because the mountain range has a long route. It not only goes up, it goes down. When two continents collide, it smashes. Some of it goes up, but some of it goes down. And over time, you erode a little bit and it pops up. It's like an iceberg. A little bit of the mountain range pops up. And it's been popping up for a long, long time, which is why they've worn down. But anyway, so maybe a beach, and maybe further offshore, and we see it getting deeper, and then we see it getting shallower again. So, any questions so far?
Why don't you think it's the bottom of the ocean?
Why don't I think it's the bottom of the ocean?
Yeah.
Well, if it were the deep ocean,
Yeah.
you wouldn't have any quartzite at all.
Right. So that's coming off of rocks.
If it was deeper,
Yeah.
what I'd be seeing is more marble, which used to be limestone. Typically, you have sand, and then you have shale, and then further offshore, you have calcium carbonate.
Yeah.
If it were more modern, if it were younger rocks, it would be corals. Corals may not have evolved at this time, but you had enough lime that sometimes it would spontaneously precipitate, especially in a warm ocean, and this was very warm at this time. Climate here was very tropical, so that's my feeling.
Okay.
If it's deep ocean, you'll never find sand.
So at Lime Rock, that was deep ocean because it's
Lime Rock, it was deeper.
Yeah. much
Because you
deeper.
had
Okay.
now Lime Rock may have been before corals and shell making organisms evolved,
Right.
so it may have inorganically precipitated. It can be relatively shallow water,
Right.
but if it's really near the delta, then it gets the lime gets overwhelmed by the sand and the mud. So that's why
Right.
I would say Lime Rock is probably deeper water. This marker here, you can see this didn't come from here. This is from the western side of the fault. It's a diorite. You'll see a lot of that at Lincoln Woods. It's a rock, unlike the lava that flows on the surface. This is a rock that cooled over tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, because you can look and you can see all the individual crystals in it. You can see individual crystals of feldspar and hornblende, mica. So it takes an incredible long time for those to cool. So the only way it could cool over that long period of time is it was buried very, very deep within the earth, and later either uplifted or eroded away. Wait, you were going to mention the...
Oh, if you want to go see the markings that the canal boat ropes made,
Sure.
I can show you.
Sure.
Okay.
We'd love. And the way we thought back in the 50s and 60s was that if you dump hazardous waste over there and the water runs to the river, right? You dump the waste over there, you might contaminate the river, but we'd be okay on the other side of the river since the water flows towards the river here and it flows towards the river there, and so we'd be okay. Quite a bit uphill from here. The municipal wells for the town of Lincoln, the Quinville wells. And they dumped hazardous waste here, contaminated the wells up there. And now we understand these were what we call dense non-aqueous phase liquids, very dense organic molecules that have a way of working their way down into the cracks of the rock where most of the groundwater is stored. And when you pump the well really hard, you pull from underneath the river and you pull all that contamination up into the public water supply, and you make it undrinkable. So that became and still is a Superfund site, and we can stop the contamination from migrating significantly, but we'll probably never be able to clean it up completely, because once it gets into an aquifer, once those kind of chemicals get into an aquifer, we don't yet have the technology to get them out.
So
and I could go and talk forever about why that is, but
So was it in linking the surface aquifer, or was it an artesian aquifer that it went down to?
it was a bedrock aquifer.
All right.
In Rhode Island, you generally only have unconsolidated sand and all for about 20 or 30 feet.
Right.
So any time you build a municipal well, you're going to go way down deep into the bedrock.
Yeah.
And the bedrock is where those fractures can carry contamination far, because you're drawing from a long distance when you pump. Same thing happened in North Smithfield with Stamina Mills.
Which mills?
Stamina Mills,
Stamina.
where again you could make
in
the
Forest
water
Hill.
flow uphill. If you
Yeah.
pump enough water, the contamination will flow uphill.
Yeah.
We'll pass in a little ways, you'll see a hill here, and it's the J.M. Mills landfill, which is another hazardous waste site. And that was, at the time, Mr. Mazalkowski, who owned it, if I own the water, I can dump whatever I want into the water. Actually dump the fill into the water and move the river over. At the time, that was okay. It's because of that, it was one of the first sites in the nation that made states like Rhode Island institute wetlands regulations, because it turns out if you fill in the water on your property, my property that used to be dry isn't dry anymore, because I'm just doing it on my property and I'm moving the water onto your property. So this site was a key part of changing both the environmental laws in Rhode Island, because it turned out if I dump on that side of the river, it affects this side of the river, and it also changed the wetlands laws in Rhode Island. This behind us, this wetlands here, was all the Lonsdale Drive-In. So for many years, I don't know how many years, 40 years, 50 years?
Yeah.
A lot of people fell in love here right, when they were
Yes.
young.
Yes.
And
made the next generation.
and made part of a generation probably. So the DEM, when it bought this property, now at the time they built the drive-in, people thought of wetlands as they're areas that breed mosquitoes and they're stinky, and so if we can pave it over and put asphalt there and then have a movie theater, we've done a good thing. Wasn't until later we realized wetlands are incredibly important. Ecologically, wetlands are incredibly important. And things like amphibians, frogs and salamanders that actually eat mosquitoes need the wetlands to breed. The mosquitoes don't need the wetlands. The mosquitoes will breed anywhere there's water, standard. But a lot of species, it's a critical part of their ecology that we have wetlands that are wet for part of the year and dry for part of the year. But also geologically, what wetlands do is when there's a storm and this whole area fills up with this much water and it's standing water, it has time to infiltrate into the aquifer. And then when you have a dry period, the river keeps flowing because the aquifer that had been recharging all that time is now discharging into the river. So it helps preserve the ecology for the whole area, because you've got a supply of water that you have during the dry season that can keep plants and animals alive. So when you start destroying the wetlands, which we probably lost about 70% of the wetlands that we once had in Rhode Island, when you destroy the wetlands, then you feel that cycle of wet and dry a lot more because you don't have this moderating effect of the wetlands. So now we understand wetlands are a lot more important. So the department actually took up all the asphalt and tried to restore a wetland meadow that it had been. And you can see over time, you would barely know that was a parking lot. I remember when that was an asphalt parking lot.
And in the 20s and 30s, they used to oil all the swamp around here so that they could kill the mosquitoes. They would put, like, you know, a quarter of an inch of petrol on the
And there's no ecological effects to that at all.
No,
But
it would wash away like crazy.
it's how differently we see things. You know, that at one time you thought, I'll do a good thing. I'll dump all this oil into the wetlands. The other thing that wetlands do is just as important is all this green vegetation that you see, that's taking the nutrients, which are basically the pollution, you know, and it's uptaking those nutrients so that they don't get discharged into the water, because all those nutrients going into the water make the water lower the oxygen levels, because the bacteria just go crazy when they get that many nutrients. Lowers the oxygen level, and then things like fish all die because it becomes anoxic. So they also have this critical function that they keep excess nutrients out of our water supply. So we understand that now, and so we look at that meadow and say that's actually a really good thing, not a nuisance. Dig beneath here, you're going to find some of this, which is shale, but it contains fossils in it. These are fossil plants, and coal as well. And if you look here, you can see, and I don't know, you're probably too far away, but you can see little bits of stem. This actually is probably really hard to see on a camera, but I will pass it around, but you'll have to, when you shine it to the light, you'll see little stems of plants in this shale. So this represents, these are about 350 million years old. They're from a time known as the Carboniferous period. Not coincidentally, it has the word carbon in it. It represents a really pivotal moment in the evolution of plants. Up until that time, there were plants that had developed the ability to live on land, but they were things like mosses. They were very small. They couldn't stand upright. Plants in the just before the Carboniferous period, plants evolved the ability, some plants evolved the ability to make cellulose, which allows you to make a tree trunk. Tree is actually not an accurate botanical term, because trees aren't one group. There are many different plants have evolved this ability to grow really large and send out leaves, which allows you to outcompete all the things on the ground. So the plants evolved the ability to make cellulose. One of the things about cellulose is it's very difficult for animals to break down. It's very tough. It's the only fossil that you'll find in this area, because it's the only fossil material that can survive that kind of pressure. So the plants evolved the ability to make cellulose, which is very difficult to break down. It took a long time for the animals to catch up. When you have a new kind of plant and then a new kind of animal evolves to eat it, it took animals an enormous amount of time to catch up evolutionarily to be able to break down cellulose. And it required the combined forces of fungus and bacteria and things like termites evolved that were able to break down cellulose. But for a long time, the plants won that war, where they made up something the animals couldn't break down. So what do trees do? And these particular trees were a kind of moss that grew to 30 or 40 feet high. So it was at a time when animals couldn't break them down, fungus couldn't break them down, bacteria couldn't break them down. They had an invincible bark. So the trees just grew and they died, and then other trees grew and they died, and they just got washed into the the deltas, the river deltas and all, and they just stayed there. And it was a time when life, this happens occasionally, life altered the climate of the planet. What do plants do? They take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They produce oxygen as a waste product, and they produce a carbohydrate, in this case cellulose. Right? So they took all this carbon and pulled it out of the atmosphere and buried it, because now the tree dies and it gets buried by mud and sand, and so you're sequestering all this carbon out of the atmosphere. So much so that you caused a major episode of global cooling. You changed the climate of the entire planet. And this carbon that you sequestered 350 million years ago, most of it just stayed there. And the only way the carbon got released is when we developed the ability to mine it and burn it and release that carbon back into the air that the plants had pulled out of the air, and they created a climate that was relatively cold. Now we're developing the ability to reverse those effects. The other thing is, when you had hundreds and hundreds of feet, maybe thousands of feet of dead wood, and then you put it under pressure, what happens? You make peat moss, and then you put it under more pressure, and you make lignite, and then you put it under more pressure, and you make soft coal, bituminous coal. Then you put it under an incredible amount of pressure, you make hard coal called anthracite. And Rhode Island, our coal is anthracite. It's the hardest coal. We actually are a harder version of anthracite than most of the anthracite that got mined. The thing about anthracite is it burns really hot, but it takes a long, long time to get it to burn because it's so refined. It's so hard. So the quote was made that when the fires of hell consume the earth, the very last thing it's going to burn is Rhode Island coal. So I'm figuring that somebody said that who was probably frustrated trying to get Cumberland coal to burn. So below us was a coal mine. And the thing about these coal mines, they were made at a time when there wasn't a lot of regulation. You just dig a hole wherever you want. And then when coal runs out, you go home. And nobody knew the coal mine was here until the 1930s when it collapsed. And there are other coal mines like that in Rhode Island. We don't know exactly where they are because there weren't maybe precise records kept. People just knew there was a coal mine somewhere and it closed. So we are standing on the site of a former coal mine collapse.